Welcome to the ISM Western New York Lunch and Learn webinar series. Our program for today will be Supply Chain 2026 Outlook and Trends. Oh my gosh, what a year 2025 was. Please be sure to put any of your comments or questions in the chat box for Kelly. Our speaker today will be Kelly Barner, and I'm sure everybody remembers her. She was our speaker last year, last January as well, who is the head of content and operations at Art of Procurement. Kelly has worked in procurement since 2003, starting as a practitioner and then serving as the associate director of consulting at Importaris.
Taurus. Yes.
Importaris. She has her MBA and from Babson College, as well as an MS in Library and Information Science from Simmons College, and has co-authored 3 books. I'm not sure if there's more by this time. And Supply Market Intelligence for Procurement Professionals, Procurement at the Crossroads, and Finance Unleashed. In 22, Kelly was one of the first 100 members of the LinkedIn Creator Accelerator, can't even get my words straight today, Accelerator program, where she led an in-depth project into the current status and future potential of supplier diversity, and was selected as one of 19 podcast hosts, and Kelly is fantastic in the programs that she does, to participate in the first LinkedIn Podcast Academy before being added to the LinkedIn Top Voice program. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kelly. I know you have a lot to go over today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathy, for having me back. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I will also share with this audience, doesn't always translate depending on geographically where I'm speaking to folks from, but my practitioner time in procurement, I actually worked for the parent company of Stop and Shop, which New York people will know. And it was interesting because all through high school and college, I worked in the stores. So I got to kind of see operations from the ground level and then working on not for resale services at corporate. So a little bit of a local tie there. Just to give you a little bit more about my background, I know Kathy shared a whole bunch. I've been procurement for over 20 years. I'm not going to change that till it's 30 plus, and then maybe we'll pretend it wasn't quite so much. But I co-founded Buyers Meeting Point back in 2009, acquired my purchasing center, which a lot of you will know in 2020. And then both of them in 2022 were actually rolled into Art of Procurement. I am so incredibly passionate about the role that procurement teams can play, not just in being cost effective and risk averse for their companies, but to genuinely drive competitive advantage. Now, maybe more relevant to today's topic is when I'm not talking about procurement, I'm completely focused on supply chains. One of the roles that I was very lucky to hold while I worked for Taurus was I actually spent 2 years completely dedicated to, at the time, it was Conway. Now it's part of XPO. So I was leading their procurement transformation, but it gave me the opportunity to do that for a logistics company, and I was completely hooked. So a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today are more supply chain than they are procurement, but they're all very much focused on, as Kathy said, what a crazy year we had in 2025. And 2026 is showing no signs of slowing down. Now, before I get into the topic, I did want to share a little bit about Art of Procurement. We've been very luckily growing over the last few years. And at this point, our business is actually in 4 different verticals or pillars as we talk about them. Certainly, we are first and foremost a podcast. Art of Procurement is the #1 procurement podcast worldwide. But we also last year started moving into ProcureTech. We bought the ProcureTech 100, a program, if any of you have followed it in the past. It was previously run by Lance Younger and his team. Art of Procurement acquired that. And that includes the ProcureTech 100, the yearbook, and also something that takes us into our third pillar here, which is Founder Circle. So last year, we also started running in-person events because running a podcast wasn't stressful enough. We had to add in catering and linens and getting together, but nothing substitutes for that face-to-face time and having the opportunity to meet people in person. And then finally, we're building out our digital enablement practice. So helping companies figure out what should be on their roadmap, helping them figure out which platforms are the right to implement, and then actually getting those solutions and negotiating them and putting them in place. So that's a little bit about art of procurement. Now I want to zoom way out, and there are 10 trends and predictions that we're going to go through today. Now, I'm going to break down all 10 right up front so you sort of know the general context of what we're going to go through today. But there's a couple of rules to this before we get started. With the exception of one, none of these predictions are mine. I sort of combed the internet and the news at the end of last year. I wanted to see what the really smart people thought was going to happen in 2026. So I'll let you know the source for each of these as we go through. I have lots of facts and things to share. So if you see me glancing down, that's what I'm doing. I'm pulling in all of my details. But there are also no guarantees. 2025 and even the 5 years before that, it's been such a time of change digitally, from a supply chain standpoint, geopolitically, even regulatorily. And so we just don't know. But there are some incredibly smart and brave people out there that were willing to look at the trends that they're watching and make some predictions for the year. And I actually think they're very compelling. So the first five that we're going to go through is more supply chain localization. So completely the opposite of the globalization that we've seen in past years. That some of the supply chain uncertainty we've been experiencing is going to start affect how companies handle strategic sourcing and who they choose to partner with. That we will hopefully close the decision to data gap. That freight prices will go up, certainly something that we don't want to hear, but it does create an opportunity for procurement. That supply partners will become the focus of cyber risk concerns. So, not just your own company, but now we have to worry about how secure our suppliers are. The humanoid robots will remain on the unemployment line, at least for now. 2026 is supposedly not going to be the year that will all be replaced, at least by physical robots. The generous e-commerce returns we've seen in the past are going to start to become a luxury that an increasing number of companies roll back and maybe save as a perk for their most loyal customers. That we have something new to worry about, digital provenance. So I'll get into what that means in a minute. That when we're trying to increase the resilience and the agility of our supply chains, having a plan B or C or D is no longer going to be enough. And then finally, I did save one for myself. My prediction for 2026 is that we're going to see even more interconnectivity between the public and private sectors, especially around supply chains and how they are run. So that's our, oops, sorry about that, going the wrong way, my Apple mouse here. All right, so starting with the first one, that we should expect more supply chain localization. Now, my source for this is a poll that was done of 1,800 global executives, and it was run by Prologis and the Harris poll. 58% of those executives expect supply chains to become more localized by 2030. And even though that's 5 years out, they think we're going to start to see some of those dynamics change this year. So now what I wonder about with those 1,800 executives, are they talking about the supply chains they are managing, or are they talking about all supply chains? This is one of those things where, I know with different testing, if you ask someone a question about themselves, you're going to get one answer. If you ask someone a question about their neighbor, you're going to get a different answer. So I do wonder if this is specific to the supply chains that they're managing. Do they feel peer pressure to localize, or are they actually putting the moving pieces in place to start driving those changes themselves? Now, one of the things that I find interesting about this particular prediction is that it's localization and not reshoring. So when we think about how big or how long of a supply chain is actually being pulled in closer, this could potentially be either global supply chains that are being pulled into a smaller circle and reshored, or it could be supply chains that already have a fair amount of representation domestically that are getting even closer to home. And that brings us into a tie-in in terms of the consumer base and the press that's associated with those changes. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this is the 2030. If companies are starting to put those changes in place so that by 2030, they truly have more localized supply chains, they're expecting it to take a while to make these changes, which also means it would be much harder to unroll or undo those changes. And I think it's interesting because it's truly a commitment that companies are going to have to make. In some cases, they'll be able to say, okay, I want to partner with a supplier in my state, in my city, in my region. In other cases, they may have to vertically integrate. They may have to invest in a supplier to make this possible. So the longer they expect it to happen, and I will point out, I promise I'm not going to get political today, but when we look at 2030, we are talking about extending into the next presidential administration, whoever that happens to be. So companies aren't just talking about, oh, this year we're going to invest X billion or X million dollars in local businesses. They're genuinely talking about restructuring. So the harder it is to implement, the harder it is to roll back. This could really end up meaning some pretty significant change to our supply chains. Now, a lot of this, whether it's reshoring or just localization, has been driven by the level of uncertainty we've seen. In some cases, it's uncertainty because we're not sure about tariffs. We're not sure about being able to, for instance, use the Suez Canal. They're just starting to test reopening that. How long will it take? How much will it cost? Against the backdrop of consumers wanting even more flexibility and faster turnaround on the availability of product. Now, according to Moody's, all of this uncertainty and the added costs that go with it are not just leading to sourcing teams changing the way they do things. They're actually leading to what they describe as, quote, sourcing paralysis and sourcing reconfiguration. So it's a little bit like strategic procrastination. If I'm so uncertain about what's going to happen, then I'm probably very uncertain about what I should do as a result. And if I can put that decision off until tomorrow or next month or next quarter, maybe an increasing number of teams will make that decision. Now, this may lead to existing contracts being extended. It may lead to purchases being pushed off. That's going to vary by category. But it's certainly understandable that if there's a lot of uncertainty, the longer you can wait, the better. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that some of the tariffs we're currently seeing have been changing not just indecision, but also timing. So, for instance, there are a number of different decisions that we're waiting for about the legality of certain tariffs. We've seen manufacturers try to get ahead of that and import things. We've also seen at different times manufacturers say, I'm going to wait and delay importing because I want to make sure I have as much information as possible before I make a decision about a big purchase. And yet, these decisions can't be delayed forever. So, more flexibility, changing timing, indecision, teams will be handling all of this very differently. And of course, I have to think that it's going to affect the level of optimization scenarios and the number of those that are being run, just so that as procurement is making recommendations around timing, around location, around sourcing, that we can quantify to the best of our ability, what does it mean to source from here, to source now, to source from there, to source then? All of that is going to come into question. Now, speaking of making decisions, I thought this was really interesting, and it comes from Supply Chain Brain. According to their reporting, consultancy West Monroe actually thinks that the goal for this year, now this is interesting, is to have reliable data available sooner after making a decision. So it's interesting that they're not predicting sort of the holy grail of real time or predictive data and analytics. They're simply saying that we think data will be available and will be clean enough or able to be analyzed well enough that we're going to know much more quickly if we made the right decision or if we made the wrong decision. Now, it's not ideal. Everybody, of course, would rather have reliable data before having to make a decision. But it seems to me that because it's a realistic prediction, we're not talking about flying cars, we're just talking about having the data sooner, that maybe it's a little bit more likely to happen. We've talked about predictive analytics for years, and it sort of remains elusive, even with all of the AI power that we have today. So even if we don't have data available in the moment that a decision has to be made, I think it's interesting that we're getting closer. Now, I don't want to be a party pooper here because I know AI is sort of like the knight in shining armor coming in to rescue us from every single business problem. AI is still going to be limited in terms of its impact if we don't have good, fast data to feed it. There's only so much it can do. And there's some amount of using AI to fill in gaps, to forecast. We're getting there. But I feel like we're always going to be sort of chasing the benefits we want until we can get solid data available to us a little bit faster. Now, prices going up is never ideal, but we're being told to expect this in 2026 by Prologis. Now, in 2025, freight prices across the board were up about 3.5%, and they expect that increase to continue into this year for a number of different reasons. Smaller carriers are leaving the space, and new drivers are not emerging in the volume that we would need to replace those leaving the field. Now, this is also a place where regulatory scrutiny is coming to play. There's been a number of high profile accidents in the last 12 to 18 months where, as it turned out, the drivers either were not qualified according to federal standards or did not have the legal right to work in the United States. So, as the DOT is increasing their scrutiny, and of course, they're always getting into battles with California, that is going to take some drivers off the road while we get the whole system figured out. Not necessarily related directly to freight prices, but it will have an impact as companies have to fight for drivers and pay higher salaries. Now, the other dynamic that Prologis mentions in their prediction is real estate. And as these freight prices go up, real estate is going to be one of the things that allows freight companies to hopefully contain costs. So you could potentially have a freight company with a great real estate strategy that ends up having a competitive advantage because they're either strategically located in terms of where they're able to hold or distribute freight from, or simply because they can shorten the distance that goods need to travel from a point to the location you're trying to get them to. Now, on the buy side of this, anybody that's ever sourced LTL or full truckload freight, time to maybe brush off those complex old spreadsheets or bring in a consultant if you have the budget for it. Those sourcing projects are some of the most complex to manage and negotiate and put contracts in place for. But as these prices go up, the trade-off ends up being worthwhile for procurement and, like I said, consultants to put that effort in to get those prices under control. Now, as things remain digital, I think this is an interesting one to call attention to. That the focus of companies' cyber risk concerns is increasingly going to be their suppliers. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is new. I mean, it was years ago that Target's POS supplier actually had a data link. So the little box at the cash register where you put in your information and pay, it was the software provider for those boxes where they had a leak. So these things have happened. But from a systematic risk management standpoint, an increasing number of companies are going to be looking to their suppliers to see where does the risk exist, what are you doing to manage it, and how can you keep us posted on the investments that you're making. Now, Insurance Edge was one of the publications that covered this story and the prediction, and they said, quote, as businesses adopt more cloud services and rely on a broader network of suppliers, smaller vendors are becoming the preferred entry point for attackers. Many organizations still lack visibility into the cyber risks posed by interconnected systems, end quote. So, for instance, if you're a company, maybe that localized according to our other prediction, or maybe that has put a lot of investment into small, diverse, sustainable suppliers, the smaller they are, the potentially riskier they are. Not because they're making mistakes, but because someone's actually targeting them. The bad guys just simply know that it's much easier to hit a small company than it is to hit a larger one. So, what this means for procurement and for companies is that those InfoSec questionnaires that we're so good about running and maybe a little bit less good about reading have to be refreshed, making sure that there are cybersecurity questions in there, making sure that IT is doing a full comparative review of the responses, and maybe even making sure procurement is reading those as well, staying up to date on what the primary areas of concern are, especially if a provider is ever going to have customer data or any kind of private data running through their software. Making sure that that's all up to date is absolutely essential because nobody wants to be in the news. Back to my Target example. Who knows what the name of that software company was? But we remember Target. So it's always the bigger company with the more recognizable brand that ends up taking the PR hit. Now, our poor robots, we're all competing with the software based robots as AI and agentic AI come into play. But it seems as though, even with the advancements that have been made with some of these humanoid robots potentially placed in warehouses or distribution centers, this is not going to be the year for them. This is according to a Forrester prediction that was reported on by Supply Chain Exchange. And the reason that they don't think this is going to be the year is that most of the press releases and videos demonstrating capabilities are just a little bit more excited than companies are to invest in the robots and the infrastructure required to support them to bring them in. Now, I think there's a couple of different ways we can look at this. And of course, one does relate to AI. There's always a curve, whether you think of it as an adoption curve or a hype cycle that goes with these things. We may just simply be in a dip. And we've gone through that a little bit with AI. We're also going through it with physical robots. They're simply really expensive, and the batteries that go into them and the metals that go into making them make it a serious investment, even if you are going to save long term. Now, the interesting thing is, I don't think this is just humanoid robots. I mean, a little bit of leeway here. I promise it's connected. Back in December, iRobot declared bankruptcy. So they're the maker of the Roomba robot vacuum. And part of why they gave the reason for declaring bankruptcy is that the things that they need to make those robots have become so expensive to get a hold of and import that they can no longer cost effectively make those robot vacuums. I am quite certain that humanoid robots are made of different things than the little Roomba that you might film your cat riding around on. But at the same time, I have to think that directionally, the input costs are going in the same direction. So, as much as the two don't necessarily seem directly related, I think one might be a sign that Forrester is actually right, that this will not be the year that we go to the robots. Now, this next one I think is interesting from a business standpoint, but also from a consumer standpoint. So, if you've ever mistakenly ordered something from Amazon, ordered the wrong thing online, we've all just survived the holiday return cycle. Companies have generally been pretty generous. They either make it very easy for you to return things, very inexpensive for you to return things, or in some cases, they were even saying, you know what, just keep it. Keep it, donate it, don't send it back. Because for them, the cost associated with taking back possession of that item, tracking it, moving it somewhere, and then attempting to generate revenue from it, there simply wasn't enough in it for them. And so they were saying, nope, just go ahead and keep it. But there are signs, and again, this is a prediction from Forrester, that that's going to start to come to an end for most people. Now, Amazon and Walmart have already started moving to make stricter guidelines for returns. But instead of having generous returns go away altogether, it's instead being repositioned as a perk. So if you're somebody that's part of a loyalty club for a program, at some point, maybe there'll be, who knows, an additional level of Amazon Prime. Some of the companies are trying to reposition this to make it look a little bit less like they're pulling back a benefit and a little bit more like they're rewarding their most loyal customers. But with all of this, and this would also tie into freight costs, the cost to transport, the cost to process, they have to be constantly running the numbers and figuring out what's going to be the impact on likelihood to buy online versus how generous their returns policy is. And it seems like we've come to a little bit of a tipping point. Now, this one's really interesting because I had not heard of digital provenance before coming across this prediction from Gartner. So, digital provenance is sort of like, let's see if you've ever seen Antiques Roadshow or American Pickers, one of those where there's a branded item or something signed, and you have to prove that it's authentic, that it's legit. Are you checking the paint? Are you having a signature expert look at it? Are you flipping an item over to see if the maker's stamp is on the bottom? Well, Gartner is saying that we're going to need to start providing that kind of audit trail for our digital assets as well as our antiques and our investment assets. They point out that, quote, as organizations rely more on third party software, open source code, and AI generated content, verifying digital provenance will become essential. This refers to the ability to verify the origin, ownership, and integrity of software, data, media, and processes. So it's no longer going to be sufficient to ask AI, hey, what's the answer to this? You're going to have to track that the answer that you got or the approach to analysis that you ran was done with the assistance of AI. And knowing that and preserving that very quickly becomes a very complicated knowledge management challenge. So you can be sure there's probably going to be a new category of solutions that pops up to ensure it for us. But this is sort of an interesting new concept. And they're also putting a little bit of a line in the sand, like we heard the 2030 earlier about localization. Gartner's predicting that by 2029, anyone who does not invest in digital provenance will be opening themselves to risks and fees that could potentially run into the billions of dollars. So they think this is going to be an incredibly important thing for companies to understand and start investing in. Now, this is interesting too, because we've seen so much disruption, especially in our supply chains. And I think most of us, in an effort to be more agile, in an effort to be more resilient, have said, okay, if something goes wrong with my first choice, I'll have another supplier or another mode of transportation or some other way to get what I need. Now, what Infios is saying is that that's not going to be enough, that instead, you're actually going to have to be able to change what you're doing more quickly. So it's no longer about switching over to the backup supplier or the backup channel. It's actually about being able to change what you're doing with your plan A. As they said, and this is a quote from them, adaptability, not redundancy, becomes the new resilience metric. The most robust networks will be those that can flex dynamically while maintaining service continuity. So again, an interesting way of looking at the investments that will have to be made in supply chains, in the supply base, and of course, the information monitoring that has to go with that. And just to tie this to another one of the predictions, if we're still not getting the data until after the decision is made, we're going to continue to have to chase and push for increasingly up-to-date data if we're going to change our plan A quickly enough to sort of meet this requirement. Now, I did allow myself a splurge. This is my one prediction. And to me, this is based on a lot of the different news stories that I'm regularly covering. I think there's going to be an increasing amount of government and private business partnerships that we see specifically related to the supply chain in 2026 and beyond. Now, we've seen tariffs completely upend global trade, and it would seem that the federal government is just acting with what they think is best. But there are a number of companies, some very high profile companies, that also have the ear of the White House. And they're regularly having these conversations and participating in executive roundtables. Now, when we think about specific categories of product that could be affected by something like this, one example that I came across had to do with how we're categorizing semiconductors. So, for instance, traditionally, semiconductors were being categorized by their country of origin. So you would look and say, okay, what's the officially declared country of origin for the semiconductor versus the country of design, which might be different. Now, there's not necessarily a full and effective regulation around this yet, but it's an example of where how the federal government wants to classify things, what they then hear from these big tech companies who are able to go in and get the president's ear and share how changes will affect their business, are going to keep these conversations going. The other one I referred to earlier is around the regulations for commercial driver's licenses. So, even though the Department of Transportation is the ultimate authority over CDLs, they're completely administered and managed transactionally at the state level. So, getting those sets of expectations to align is yet another area where regulations are going to force businesses and states and the federal government to all come together and figure this out. Now, the last example that I will share here that I also think is interesting is we saw some conversations about the Panama Canal, right, going into last year. And so, who should own that? Who owns and controls those ports? There's been a lot of concern around the fact that a Hong Kong based company was able to own those ports at both ends of the Panama Canal. And as they become more and more administered by China, there's concern about the security of the United States continuing to have access to that. So that's yet another example of where BlackRock was willing to step in and make a bid to acquire those ports that allowed the federal government to say, okay, good, that satisfies us. That's what we want. But allowing a private organization to take steps that sort of takes a task off the federal government's plate. I think this only continues into 2026. Now, given that this audience, of course, is ISM Western New York, one of the other thoughts that I will share with you, and then I'll wrap and we can talk about if there's either any questions or any predictions you would like to share, more than welcome to hear those as well, is that in the Institute for Supply Management's year-end recap, Dan Zeiger wrote, "Good riddance 2025." So to that, I will say, yep, I think there's a lot of things about 2025 that we're perfectly happy to have behind us. At the same time, be careful what you wish for because none of us knows exactly what 2026 is going to hold. One more slide I will just share. And then, like I said, I'll open if there's any questions. If any of these stories are of interest to you, I am regularly covering them. Every week, the Art of Supply podcast comes out. That's in its own channel compared to Art of Procurement. I'm usually covering supply markets, supply chains, logistics, all of the regulations that connect these things, sort of pulling from news stories, and then always trying to give some sort of takeaway in addition to the information. That QR code that's up there will actually take you to my LinkedIn newsletter. That comes out every Thursday. It has the podcast player embedded in it. So if you're interested in learning more about the show, you can go there. I also encourage you, send me a connection request on LinkedIn. Let me know you were here at the webinar. I always love to meet new people, especially if they're interested enough in supply chain trends and predictions to show up at a webinar about it. And so absolutely drop me a note. Let me know that you were here and I will be glad to meet you. So with that, Kathy, I will pull you back in and see if there's any either questions or additional topics that we want to take on.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat just yet, but did want to ask you, what signals should procurement leaders be watching now to anticipate next rather than reacting too late?
My recommendation here is around staying focused on data. You know, even though most of the things that I covered are very sort of news headlines focused, I think that can be deceiving if you're actually in the business of managing supplies and spending. So certainly ISM is an amazing source of information. Watch the facts, watch for trends, read the commentary. I know it's really difficult to carve out time for that. And it can be dry to look at straight data. I'm completely realistic about that. But I think developing a sense for whether things are trending up, whether they're trending down, is not only going to give you more of a heads up, and so therefore more time to maybe start formulating a strategy, but it's also less likely to be hyped for general news consumption. So tend towards the less opinionated, less emotional, less hyped, and towards the more data-driven, assessment-based sources of information.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, Being that we're going to be, it seems like the hot topic for this year, well, what I have heard is resiliency. So this
Mhm.
question is, how is the definition of risk evolving for procurement teams, and what capabilities will distinguish resilient organizations in 2026?
Interesting. Well, certainly we saw the prediction around needing to be able to respond quickly, even though there's a shortage of data. I do think that we have a much more nuanced, not just understanding of, but relationship with risk now than we did a few years ago. To some extent, we've learned to drive with the fear, right? To strategically quote Ricky Bobby from Talladega Nights. We've gotten away from this idea that we can somehow prevent risk or control risk or move away from it. Instead, it's about where on the continuum of risk acceptance and tolerance is your company? And I think that's not going to be the same across all categories of spend. It's also not going to be the same as you go through the year or the quarter or the business cycle. There's going to be times of the year and parts of the business that are more risk averse. And then there's going to be times of the year and parts of the business that say, you know what? We've done our homework. We're going to take a calculated risk in a limited way. And I think it's that starting to think about risk in a more detailed way, on a lower level, and understanding whether it's spending a little bit more time with small supplier information security reviews, right, as part of an RFP, or whether it's looking at an emerging category of technology, an emerging application of agentic AI, and thinking, okay, we're going to run a pilot. So let's control this, but we're going to knowingly take a risk in this part of the business. I think the more detailed we can get versus just saying, nope, that's too risky, I'm going to stay away from it, I think we'll be able to make some more strategic and pointed decisions.
And do you have one piece of advice for our audience for supply chain 2026?
One piece of advice for supply chain. Let me think for a second. I think the one thing that I would say, and it's certainly easy for me from my seat where I'm covering supply chain from a almost a business storytelling standpoint, is continue to love the variability that working in supply chain brings. People will comment to us all the time, whether we're prepping for a podcast or one of our own webinars, that one of the best things about working in procurement and supply chain is that you never know what a day is going to bring. Remember or try your very best to feel positively about that, to see that as an opportunity, as an adventure, even in the work context. I do think the last few years have been unusually stressful, and I think it's worn everyone. But finding a way to remain enthusiastic about all of the new opportunities and all of the new things to try, staying connected to community, right? So that you're not bearing any of that stress or uncertainty alone, I think is critical. But genuinely remaining excited, welcome every change, try to be open-minded as things come up. I think that would be my sort of big picture piece of advice around supply chain.
Oh, thank you. We did have a question come in.
Mhm.
Do you feel that human robots could facilitate the return to domestic manufacturing, given the potential future impact of tariffs?
So great question, Robert. And I'm going to say yes and no. So where I'm going to say no, I think is specifically on the humanoid robot piece. I mean, these things are incredible. I've seen some of them in person. So I'm in the Boston area. The Boston Museum of Science has a number. There's Boston Dynamics, the sort of dog-looking one, but then there's sort of the humanoid one. I've seen some of the Tesla robots. They're amazing. I think as much as those get the press and the excitement, I actually think the robots, and this is my yes piece of my answer, where we're going to see a lot is the ones, and I forget what they're called off the top of my head, but that move things around, for instance, in an Amazon warehouse. I think we're more likely to have more warehouses going dark. They talk about like they don't necessarily need to be lit because there's not a lot of human workers in them than the humanoid piece. So I think rather than being a one-for-one replacement where we're putting sort of a robot that looks like a person into a person's job, I think we're more likely to see that with sort of like the moving things around or shifting things and allowing that to change how we're actually structuring things in the warehouse. I will also say this ties to something that I didn't talk about in the predictions, but that we definitely saw in 2023 and 2024 very loudly is the continued power and influence of organized labor. There's the UPS contract with the Teamsters, there's the United Auto Workers. We had the East and Gulf Coast ports, that union renegotiating their contract. They don't even want automation that's equivalent to like your garage door opener that opens a gate when somebody pushes a button. They want somebody sitting there physically moving the gate. So I think that's going to be another one of the tensions that we see play out that may make it difficult for companies that want to embrace non-humanoid robots as quickly as they might otherwise.
Thank you. One last question, because I know we're going to
Sure.
be wrapping up soon.
Yeah.
Besides transportation industry and in general terms, what are our financial expectations year to year for
Mm.
2026? For example, interest rates expected to continue to decrease, but COGS may be up due to localization.
Yeah. So I do think it's interesting. I mean, I think assuming the interest rates do continue to go down, we may see companies more likely to make capital investments, that kind of thing. I think where I'm concerned financially is around the job market. I mean, anytime you think about what generative or agentic AI can do, it's amazing. Even the simplest software or online platform that you use for some task, everyone is baking AI into everything. And there's no question it's going to have a headcount impact. And that ties into financial performance as well. So I think it's probably going to be a year of adjustment as companies figure out, to your question, Kathy, where their risk tolerance is on trying new things, where they decide to invest from a capital standpoint. But it certainly could drive the decision to buy a piece of equipment and put it in the United States. And so not only is there the option to work with local suppliers or to reshore if you're actually looking to bring things back to the US, but it could be that more things get done in-house because a company can afford some massive piece of equipment that does cutting or does something else that allows them to bring something that a supplier would have done in the past in-house and have somebody run it with minimal hands-on time. So I think it's going to be a very interesting year financially. I think it's the first year we've actually had agentic AI right from January 1st, and so that will be interesting. But I think it's going to be trade-offs. There's going to be benefits in some parts of the economy and possibly downsides in some of the others. We're just going to have to see how it all shakes out.
Yes, 2026, we're up for a ride.
I know. Look out.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly, for bringing all this information and for answering our questions today. We appreciate you coming and we appreciate the audience today too, as well. Um,
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone who's joined.
okay, thank you all and have a great day. And thanks, Kelly.
Take care.